Welcome to a new wave of entrepreneurship. I'm Latifa Farah, Associate Creative Producer at Venture for Canada and the producer of a new wave of entrepreneurship. The focus of this podcast is to hear from changemakers and Canadian entrepreneurs to learn about how they've developed their entrepreneurial mindset and skills. In Season 7, we'll be chatting with CEOs, founders, and successful business leaders about their career journeys. We're excited to dive into these conversations about how to foster your entrepreneurial mindset and drive. On this episode, we are joined by Janet Bannister, a partner of Real Ventures, Canada's preeminent early-stage venture capital firm. Janet has led investments in over a dozen companies and works actively with founders and their companies to accelerate their growth. In 2004, Janet launched Kijiji.ca and grew it to become one of the most visited websites in Canada. In this episode, Scott and Janet will discuss learning how to make difficult decisions.
I am incredibly excited to have Janet Bannister on Venture for Canada's podcast, A New Wave of Entrepreneurship, this morning. Janet, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much, Scott. It is great to be here.
Thanks so much for joining the program today. It was a pleasure speaking with you a couple months ago in the pre-chat. And one of the things that I remarked in researching you and listening to a bunch of interviews that you've done on other podcasts, Janet, is how you think about difficult decisions. And every day through your career, you've had to make hundreds of difficult decisions, either as a business leader, as a venture capitalist, and in many other kinds of roles. And you've worked with literally hundreds of entrepreneurs and seen them make thousands of tough decisions, from decisions around raising investment capital to laying off employees to launching new products. When you think about really difficult decisions that you've had to make in your career, what are some of the main frameworks, the principal mental models that you leverage when making these tough decisions?
I would, just to be clear, sort of separate two types of decisions. One is almost business types of decisions where you can use, and other sort of quantitative decisions where you can use data. So by that, what I mean is, should we expand? Should we invest? Should we expand the business? Should we invest in this business? How much, all those sorts of strategic or business questions. Then wherever I can, I like to use data. And my early career was at Procter & Gamble, McKinsey, and eBay, which were all very data focused organizations. So I like to use data where I can, analyze the data. And also, I'm a big believer in looking elsewhere around the world to see what has either around the world or in other industries or in other cases, and learning from other experiences. So that's sort of more, as I said, business type of decisions. But then I think what you're asking more about is, I'll call them life decisions, which do not fit in a nice spreadsheet, and more things like, okay, what should I do with my career? How do I want to set up my life to achieve the right level of work-life balance that I want? And so on those, I do a few things. First of all, I think about, okay, what gives me energy? What really fulfills me? And what do I think that I'm good at? And sort of an intersection of all of that is helpful. I also love to talk to other people. I'm a bit of an extrovert by nature. And so I love to talk to other people and get other people's perspective. And what I find is, I don't look to other people to make the decision for me, but I talk to other people so that they can challenge my own thinking and provide additional perspective. And I find that as I talk to more people, they will say, well, what about this? And have you thought about the situation from this angle? And then after talking to a bunch of different people, I get those thoughts, and then I reflect on it myself. And I often find that that is extremely helpful. But I think that listening to other people, I think, is good, but you have to be careful that you're listening to them in the context of, I want them not to tell me what to do. I want them to provide perspectives or to challenge me so that I can see the situation in a different light.
And to your point, in most cases, there is no objective truth. And a person giving you feedback, it's just their perspective. And it's to say it's important to understand that perspective, but it's also important to understand 5, 10, 15 different perspectives, because each person is going to see a situation slightly differently. In the pre-show, Janet, one of the things you talked about was how you really like to write down your thoughts when you're dealing with a particularly knotty, a particularly complex issue. How does writing help you as you reflect on really difficult decisions?
I find that it gets my thoughts going, like just having a pen and paper, and I will write down thoughts. And then often what happens is, I will come back a day or two later and reread what I wrote and think, does that really hold? Well, why did I think that? Oh yeah, here are 5 reasons. And let me write out the pros and the cons, and then I'll start writing more things. Or sometimes, a framework comes to me when we're thinking about things. Like earlier we were talking about, like, hey, how do you figure out how to spend your time? And I sort of was writing one day and I started drawing concentric circles, and that helped me think about what's important. How can I spend my energy? How do I spend my time?
Shifting back to our previous topic that we were talking about, which was about the challenger function. In essence, that some of the most effective mentors, some of the most effective advisors aren't the people who just agree with you all the time, but rather the people who really productively challenge you. In what way, what advice do you have for somebody who is potentially an advisor or looking to be an advisor or looking to provide help to a friend or colleague on how to be really productive at challenging? Because, and to give a little bit more context on this, is I think that when done well, it can be incredibly effective. But people giving advice in this kind of way can also get people's backs up. It can cause a lot of challenges. So what advice do you have for individuals on really on how to be productive challengers?
So I think, and it's a good question, because I talk to a lot of people who are going through different things in their life, as well as, business founders who are always thinking about different things. And I would say, first of all, like everything, it also has to come from sort of the inner who you are. And so your perspective rather than being a tool. And so I would say, starting with my perspective is that I should not be making any decisions for a founder, for a colleague, but I'm there. I just one person who happens to have one perspective. So that's what I truly believe, which then makes the next part, which I'm going to talk about, easier, which is I always I try to ask questions rather than tell them what to do. Or I will give examples from my own personal life, being very clear around, hey, this is what worked for me, or this is what didn't work for me, or this is what I've seen in this situation. It may or may not apply in your situation, but I'll tell you about it in case it's relevant. And so I think doing things like that, or also, here is something for you to, as I said, ask questions, or say, here's something for you to consider that may or may not be true. And so, it's saying that sort of thing, I think, is extremely important, because frankly, at the end of the day, I don't want to tell somebody what to do. I don't think that is fair to the person or is the right thing to do. And I don't think, frankly, that I am smarter than anybody else, or certainly the other person is going to have more insight than I will on what's going on inside their head and what they want to do. And so that's the way I try to add value.
The ability to ask really well thought out questions is a superpower, one that is almost never taught in schools or in any kind of formal way, but I think really can be something that can be so helpful to oneself, but also to others. So Janet, what advice do you have for listeners on how to cultivate excellent questions?
I think part of it is getting really curious, and also thinking about what assumptions are being made that may not be true. Right. And so, and so I think that's something as a line of thinking is, they're making assumptions or they're thinking about the world in a certain way. Is there another way to come at it? Right. And so, as I said, it comes from a creativity and a curiosity that then can lead to insightful questions.
Daniel Kahneman, in his famous Nobel Prize winning research on economics, even though he is a psychologist by background, elucidated about how humans are essentially incredibly irrational. There are over 150 different cognitive biases, and that it is virtually impossible for us to understand our own irrationality. One of the only ways we can understand our irrationality is through other people gently pointing it out to us, through questions, through conversations. Out of interest, in your experience working with so many different entrepreneurs across Canada, but also around the world, what do you think, what are some of the cognitive biases that you see most prevalent amongst entrepreneurs?
I would say one of the cognitive biases is that other players will not move as quickly as you think they're going to move. And so I think that there's almost like the biggest thing that I see missing from entrepreneurs who are thinking about starting an early stage business is that they look at the world how it is today and say, this is why I'm going to win in this world. Or even they may think, hey, this technology is going there, that's why I'm going there. And they don't think enough about game theory and about well, yeah, okay, but you do this, and then what are the big once you start to matter, how will the larger players react, and what happens if this player does that? So I think as I said, that may be a cognitive bias in some ways. Another cognitive bias, I think sometimes on the flip side, some founders don't think big enough and think, well, I'm not sure that I can do that. I'm not sure that I can ever be that big, or maybe I can't dream that big because of who I am or where I came from or what I look like.
They're really important ones. And I think that it is so important to highlight that often our biggest mistakes that we make in life are created by ourselves, by having blind spots and ultimately pursuing things that might be irrational or ill thought out in some kind of way. When I think about decision making and life in general, one thing I often go back to is that famous Jeff Bezos quote about regret minimization. In essence, that one of the frameworks that he considers when making decisions is if he's to go into the future on his deathbed and ask himself, did I regret that decision? And if he said, his framework in life is that he will make decisions to minimize his regret in life. How does regret, or how does minimizing regret factor into the way that you think about life or the way you think about decision making?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've heard that. Frankly, I struggle with that because I've heard that before. And I'm like, well, that doesn't really help me. If I'm choosing between, let's say I'm choosing between two job offers. Well, I don't know. I could regret. If I'm choosing between, do I stay where I am or do I go to another opportunity, say, or do I stay in my job or do I regret or do I start a business? Well, yeah, I could say, hey, I start a business because I minimize regret, but what, maybe I'll regret that I left the bank just, as I say, if you're working at a bank, that just before I got promotion. So I've heard that before. I find sometimes that doesn't work as well for me in terms of, hey, how do I minimize regrets? Because it's like, well, I could regret either scenario. So I don't really think about regrets. What I think about is, Janet, like what I actually said to myself recently, I said, Janet, you need to like have the confidence to bet on yourself. Bet on yourself and you cannot go wrong. Right. And I guess where I think about that is I think like, not that I'm never going to fail, but if I'm betting on myself, then I know that either I'll be successful or I'll learn a lot. And maybe both. But so I try to do that and think about, you know what, Janet, it's okay to take a jump and to try something new. And I guess maybe that is tied in with what Jeff Bezos said about regret. I think about also, okay, Janet, like if it's 5 or 10 years later, where do you want to be? What impact do you want to have? And which route will get you there? I also recently, read a quote that was meaningful to me, and it said, a ship is safe in the harbor, but that's not what ships are built for. And I was like, yes, right? And so it's like, anyways, that really resonated with me. And I think that thinking about it ties into thinking about who you are, what gives you energy, what do you want to do, where are your passions, where are your unique skills, and leverage those, be who you are, and go out and try it. I think then I would say the other thing that I think about is I think about my life, and I think, Janet, you tried that and it really didn't work out so well. But I'm really glad I did that. Like, I learned something. I got it was a step to get somewhere else. So, don't worry so much about failure. Like, just give it a try. And if it doesn't work, that's okay. We'll pick up and we'll go on.
I love that quotation you mentioned. A ship is safe in the harbor, but that's not what a ship is meant to be. I'm paraphrasing it a little bit, but that's definitely going to stick with me for a long time. And I might even post it in our team Slack afterwards, because it's something that I think is really helpful to think about as we think about risk taking. And your answer got me thinking a little bit about risk taking as it relates to decision making and how there's risks in not taking risks. So when you're making critical life decisions, Janet, how do you think about risk?
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember, just on this whole risk thing, as I was growing up, my father was in sales. He worked at IBM and then other companies, and he was always in sales. And he used to say, some people think that sales is a risky job because you're on so much of your salary, so much of your compensation is is commission. But he said, I actually think it's less risky because you can control so much of your salary. Versus, he said, middle manager, like you could get fired for anything, right? Or you could, who knows? But you know what? If you're in sales, well, it's less risky because you're counting on yourself. And I remember that. And that's why I was like, hey, you bet on yourself. And so I think it depends how you think about risk. And is it risky to start a business? I don't know. Maybe. But maybe it's actually less risky than working in a job where somebody could come along and the company could say, we're cutting costs and you're fired tomorrow. Versus, hey, you're starting a business. Yeah, no, wait, yeah, it is risky, but at least you're in control and you can make the decisions in terms of the key decisions in the company. So I think, again, think about what we said earlier around how you think about things and how you frame things. What is risk, right? Is risk failing? Well, is that really a risk if you can pick yourself up and continue to where you were before? So I think thinking about what exactly is the risk that you are minimizing, and is that route really minimizing the risk? Or is the quote safe route actually risky as well?
Dan DeBow is a supporter of Venture for Canada, and he's been on the podcast, and he's spoken to Venture for Canada fellows many times over the years. And he often will talk about to the fellows about how people significantly misunderstand risk when making career decisions. And he talks about an example is that going to go work at Lehman Brothers in 2006, 2007, most parents would say to their kids, oh, that's a really safe job. That's a great place to go work. Flash forward a year or two later, everyone's out of a job and is packing up from the office because the company's imploded because of the global financial crisis. And to your point, I think a lot of people think that like a dead end job in a declining industry is this safer than going to bet on themselves to launch a new company, when actually going to launch a new company is in many cases a lot less risky in the long run. So really good food for thought, and something that I think about frequently when it comes to Venture for Canada. And in particular, when people say going to go work in a startup, don't do that. That's such a risky decision. One thing we were talking about in the pre-show, Janet, was about time and the fact that time is one of our most limited assets. And we have constant demands on our time from family, from friends, for exercise, for work, for volunteer engagements. The list goes on. When you think about decisions, and in particular about how you use your time, how do you balance all of these different competing demands in a way that works well for you?
As somebody, because we're talking about time now, and earlier we were talking about decisions. And I remember somebody saying once, at the end of the day, your life is determined by what decisions you make and how you spend your time. So, it's like, wow. These are two absolutely critical things. So how do I spend my time? I remember somebody saying once, and you may have heard of this, but if you have a bunch of big rocks, small rocks, and sand, and you want to stick all of those in an hourglass type of jar, or not an hourglass, in a jar, you want to stick them all in a jar, the only way like, if you put the sand in first and then the small rocks, you'll never get the big rocks in. But if you put the big rocks in and then the small rocks and then the sand, you can get it all in. And so the analogy is, hey, with time, you've got to allocate the time for those most important things first. Now, I think the problem, while that analogy works and is helpful, it does imply that, hey, everything can get into the jar. And sometimes you have to say, no, not everything can get into the jar. So, but at least that way you can say, this cup of sand is not getting in the jar because my jar is full, rather than this big rock. And so I think about my life in terms of putting, blocking my schedule with certain things. And so what I mean by that is, first, we talk first, heavy priority on getting enough sleep, exercise every day, and getting those, because I know that I need to be at my best, uh, in order to be physically, mentally, and emotionally ready for everything that happens in a day. And then I sort of take care of myself, and then take care of the people who are most closest to me, and specifically my family and my very close friends. That is, next most important thing in terms of blocking time for them. And then work sort of fills in a lot of the other spaces. But then even within work, you need to prioritize. And I think about, what are the things that I can uniquely do, and what are the things that I don't really need to do, because I'm not going to add any more value than anybody else to this. So I think about it that way, as well as, what is going to be most impactful, and how can I be most impactful, and is there a way that I can be impactful at scale rather than one-on-one?
That's a great framework to think about, and the importance of thinking about what are the unique ways that you can use your time highly effectively that others can't, and to focus on those activities that are the most additive, unique to yourself.
And so, for instance, just to give some specific examples, I had a lot of people contacting me and saying, hey, Janet, really want to understand, how do you kickstart a marketplace? Well, then I was like, okay, I'm going to write 2 articles. So I wrote 2 blog posts and published them. And then I thought, okay, now if anybody asks just sort of the same questions about, how do you kickstart a marketplace? How do you think about that? I've got 2 articles that will probably give them more information, because it really is sort of more information than a 15-minute call with me, because I've spent time thinking about things and writing it down, and it's much more efficient. So that's like one thing in terms of scale. And then the other thing is, often, I'll have people reach out to me who want to talk to me, and I think, you know what, I can have somebody else on my team talk to this person, and they will be at least as effective, some maybe more effective, than I would be in this situation.
You've worked with so many different founders, and I can imagine a lot of the conversations have sometimes focused on time management and the pressures that they face, particularly as their companies grow, potentially at very fast rates. What do you think are some of the most prevalent mistakes that founders make in using their time?
Spend time on things that don't really move the needle, or that really aren't important. And I sort of am pausing, because I'm like, okay, that's pretty generic and maybe obvious. So, to be more specific, I think it's this idea, like thinking as a founder, what are the most important things, like really prioritizing. The hardest thing to do in an early stage business is to prioritize and figure out what not to do. It's so easy to want to do everything, and the ruthless prioritization is absolutely critical for success. And it's far better to do fewer things better than a whole bunch of things. And I see this a lot with companies that are trying to do too much. They say, oh, we're going to go after 3 different types of customers, or we're going to launch in 3 markets simultaneously, versus saying we're going to do one thing and we're going to do it better than anybody else. And, I remember, for instance, when we launched Kijiji, I was like, okay, we don't have much money. We don't have much money to spend. We're going to do a few things. And one of the things we're going to do is we're going to do natural search, and we're going to be better than anybody else. We're going to do this and we're going to be the best. And, thanks to an awesome team, like, we knocked it out of the park with natural search, and it was a key to our growth, versus saying, I see too many companies saying, I'm just using this as an example, hey, we got to get customers, so we're going to try 5 different things, or 6 or 7 different things. And then everything sort of works mediocre, and you're like, well, where am I left? It's far better to say, we're going to do one thing and we're going to pour all our resources into it. And heck, if it doesn't work out, that's okay, because at least we'll know that that doesn't work and we can move on to something else.
When I think about decision making, one of the things that I often reflect it's important to balance is the speed of decision making. And when you're in an entrepreneurial environment, it's important to move fast, but also sometimes moving fast and making really important decisions fast can result in some pretty significant mistakes, or potentially falling susceptible to different cognitive biases. So, Janet, what advice do you have for listeners on how to balance speed of decision making with thorough decision making?
So I think it comes down to, what will I do with this additional time? It's like, okay, if I can't make this decision now, well, what information do I need to make that decision, and how am I going to get that additional information or input? And is it worth delaying the decision? I think too many times people will say, well, geez, yeah, we're going to have to make that decision. Not ready to make that decision now. We don't need to decide now. So let's just think about it. Quote, think about it for a while. And then a few days later, they come back. Yeah, still, let's think about it for a bit more, which is not necessarily the most effective way, as opposed to saying, this is a really tough decision. What information, or who do we need to talk to, or what data will help us make a more informed or a better decision? Okay, let's make a list of that. Let's then go and get that additional information or that additional input as quickly as possible. And let's agree that we will have got it by this date, and then we'll come back and make a formed decision by this date. Then look at it and say, okay, yeah, are we comfortable that it's okay to delay the decision by this amount of time in order to get that additional quality of decision? And I think that that's the key, right? It's just taking it that little bit more detail, because I think too many times people don't make the decision because it's too tough to make the decision. And so it's really saying, okay, just sort of putting it off indefinitely really does not help.
Not making a decision is a decision.
Yes.
Yeah, it's an important thing for people to think about, especially because many people do have fear of making decisions, particularly decisions that might be really complicated. So one related question is, what happens when an entrepreneur or a business leader makes the quote unquote bad decision? And let's say hypothetically, they put millions of dollars into a new product feature or a new product, and it's a complete flop. And there's all these sunk costs, and the results aren't coming as they were expected. What advice do you have for listeners on how to think about sunk costs and how to adapt once someone's realized that they potentially have made the wrong decision in the past?
Oh, I mean, on the one hand, you just say, hey, go forward. I think so. A couple of things. First of all, goes without saying, ideally, you're not spending millions of dollars on an idea and then having it go flop, because you're sort of starting with smaller decisions and saying, okay, let me test this before, let me test the market before I launch it. But I mean, that, sometimes you're going to make big mistakes because you can't sort of, like, I don't know, maybe you're going to acquire a company and, well, actually that didn't work. We did all our work, but you know what, it was a flop and it didn't work out. So then, you just say, okay, what did I learn, and how do I pick up, and how do I go forward, and be more intelligent, in the future. And hopefully, that's okay. I think one of the things that helps me work with startup founders who make who make mistakes, but I don't even like to say they make mistakes, who I would say are in the process of learning, and therefore not everything is going to work out the way you thought it would work out, but you are learning, is we invest in early stage startups. And I have my eye clearly on having it in helping the founder create a multi-billion-dollar company in 10 to 15 years. And if you have that mindset, and I think this is sort of relevant to decision making as well, if you have that mindset, then, oh geez, we missed this quarter, or maybe even we wasted, some money doing this. It's not the end of the world. It's like, okay, we're smarter now. How do we get back on track? How do we recover from that? What do we do now? It's okay. It's all right. We're going to be smarter. We're not, and you move on. And so I think having that long-term perspective that, hey, a mistake, it's not the end of the world. We're going to go on. We're still going to get there. How do we recover from this is extremely helpful. And again, getting back to decision making, I also think a lot about, hey, long-term, what is this thinking about making decisions to get you where you want to be in the long term is very helpful.
Agreed. I would say the mantra of this podcast has been focus on the journey, not the destination. And that's something I heard a little bit from you there. And I think it's such an important point to mention, is even things that might be really painful at the time, you learn a lot from them later on.
Yeah, I would say, just to clarify, I think you need to be very focused on the destination. I think what would strike me is, I'll go back to the ship analogy. It's like you're sailing across the ocean, right? And you need to have a map, and you need to know, okay, I want to get to the other side of the ocean, and there's that island, and I got my compass set. But you got to recognize, you know what? Like some days you're going to have a really big storm, and you're going to have to turn your boat around this, and someday you're going to get soaked, and some days the sun is going to come out, and some days it's going to be calm. And you know what? That's okay. It's all part of the journey. You're going to have to adjust your path en route. Some days are going to be good, some days are going to be bad, some days you're going to get, almost have a crash with a big ocean liner. But you know what? That's okay, because you are moving to that destination. So I think having clarity in terms of the destination is super important, so that you can take these little sort of the bumps in the road along the way as, okay, it's part of the journey. That's okay. Let me just get my ship back heading in the right direction.
A good metaphor, I think, for the thinking you just described is use a compass, not a map.
Oh, nice. Yes.
Janet, as you think about your life and decision making and people you've learned from, who's an individual that you've learned a significant amount from as it relates to decision making?
I think I would have to say, in terms of decision making, probably the person that I learned the most from is my father. He was a huge influence on my life. And I think when I think about how he made decisions in life, two things really stand out for me. Number one, he had an extremely high level of integrity and extremely high morals, and always went the high route, cared deeply about other people, put other people's interests very high on the list. And he was like just an incredibly, quote, good human being in all aspects of that. So I think that is one thing that is sort of the bedrock of my decision making. And then the other thing that is, I would say, is he had his priorities in order that were very clear, not only by what he said, but more importantly, by what he did. And so in his case, it was always family's number one, and that was it. And then, other things sort of went down from there, but that was how he made his decisions. I will say I have noticed in life, in terms of that second one, is I often hear people talk about these are the priorities in my life, but then how they act is different from that, right? And whether that comes to the role of family, the role of health, or anything else, is that, people say, I think it's true. It's like, if you want to know what's important to somebody, don't listen to what they say, look at what they do. Anyways, I think that in life you need to be the clearer you can be on what your priorities are, the easier decision making is. And I think also being clear that like I have thought about this at different points in my life, different things were prioritized. And so, for instance, when I was in my early 20s and I was on the national triathlon team, training was so important to me. And frankly, it was more important than my work. I was working at Procter & Gamble there. I did a fine job. But my training was like very, very important to me. And so that was important. Now, yeah, sure, physical fitness is important and it is a big block, but other things are very important just in terms of that. When my son was born, like the first 6 months of his life, I was on maternity leave. Like I spent an awful lot of time being a mom. Now, as I said, family is still number one for me, but it also helps, I think, in decision making and thinking about life. If you're like, in different times of your life, different things will take more time. And often with an entrepreneur, I see that all the time. Young entrepreneurs spend a lot of time in their business, but then, they get married, they have kids, their business gets more mature, they're able to surround themselves with awesome executives. They don't need to keep at that same, huge, that same work level, because they're more, as I said, they're more established, they have a team, and then they can shift and spend a bit more time on their family.
That definitely really resonates. And it's important to reflect about how you use your time is often very different based on the point of life that you're in at the specific moment. Janet, this has been a really interesting conversation. We've touched on a wide range of topics related to decision making, from how to use one's time to how to manage risk, to how your father influenced the way you think about decision making. It's been a really, really interesting conversation, particularly given the leadership experiences that you've had in your career as an operator, but also your experience is supporting so many different entrepreneurs and probably meeting thousands of different entrepreneurs over the course of your career. As we talked about, you essentially have a huge amount of data points to inform your decisions around how you think about decision making. So Janet, thank you so much for coming on the podcast this morning.
Absolutely. It is wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
That's it for this week's episode of A New Wave Entrepreneurship. Stay connected with us via our socials and our email list. Subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss our next episode. If you have feedback on today's episode, tweet us at Venture for Canada, that is Venture, the number 4, Canada, or email us at podcastadventure@canada.ca. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. I'm Latifa Farah, and that was Scott Sturrett and Janet Bannister. Until next time, stay safe, stay motivated, and stay grateful. A New Wave of Entrepreneurship is produced by Latifa Farah, and editing and mixing are also done by Latifa Farah. Basola Agamba is our editorial assistant. Mark Wallach and Premium Beat own the copyright and publishing rights related to the song used in this podcast.